And so I'm going to turn this off. We'll enter through the gate right here, walk up to the sheep, and then we can kind of take a look at where they were. Just 2 days ago, I opened up this other area, so we can kind of get a comparison of where they were and where they are now, and of course and where it was mowed, and we can get an idea of maybe what they're seeking out in terms of foodstuffs. We can get an idea of what they're avoiding. And part of that might be the time of year that it is, you know? So some of the things that they're avoiding now, maybe they would go after voraciously in the spring. But it'll give us a basis of comparison. Just a quick block of instruction. We are going to walk into the pen and walk up to the sheep. It's really important that we keep our hands down. We don't make sudden movements. They're armed. These sheep are, yeah, exactly. But yeah, so if we walk in and we keep our voices down, well, I won't, but you know, almost all of these sheep, with the exception of 2, are sired by a Katahdin ram. The Katahdin breed is a composite breed, and then the dams of these sheep are Scottish blackface Dorset crosses. The breeds that went into the Katahdin breed to make that composite are the Wiltshire Horn, which is a native of Britain and is a hair variety of sheep. They don't produce wool. The Barbados or St. Croix blackbelly sheep, which are also hair breed, and the Dorset, I believe, is the third to create that composite. So really, they're mutts is the answer to that question.
They're such nice mutts.
They're nice mutts.
But do you have to shear them?
No.
At all?
No.
Not the Scotties.
Well, the black-faced Dorset crosses, yes, we have to shear.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Sheep really are smarter than most people. They're in the shade, and we're not. Of course, they're also a little bit nervous about us being up here. But you can see where the path is. It's a mowed. That's a management technique, right? These paths get mowed frequently throughout the growing season. And if we had sheep on here continuously, this entire property would look very similar to that with enough stock density, meaning enough animals per unit area. Pointy little muzzles and their teeth, they will crop very close. Of course, they don't have any front top teeth, but because they're ungulates, but they will crop the vegetation very close to the soil, and that does 2 things. It looks pretty from a distance, but it predisposes those plants that have been cropped so short to drought stress, well, stress of any sort. And so we can have areas that look pretty as long as we're getting a lot of rain, but in short order can go into drought stress, and we can have erosion problems. We can have all sorts of ecological issues with overgrazing, and that's essentially what that is. What we're trying to do here is show that we can manage the sheep, use their ability and their desire for high quality forage in a targeted way, not to overgraze, but to prune, if you will. And, and so we can take a look. Again, that side of the path was opened up 2 days ago. This is about 10 days worth of pressure. You can see that they've stripped the leaves off of these stems. If it was June, those stems would be mowed. They would be chewed right down because the lignin content and some of the bioactive compounds that the plant creates to protect itself are not as strong when the plant is growing at that stage. So the sheep are also, like, this is thistle. I think it's Canada thistle.
Yeah.
And that too has been stripped. So even though those little spines at the ends of the leaves are prickly and bother us, the sheep have decided to start eating that. But we can see very quickly the differences in time. And so one management technique we can employ is to put up what's called a back fence. We allow the sheep into here, and we put up a new fence so that they can't come back in here to overgraze this space. Does that make sense? What we're really managing is root systems. Root systems in the soil, energy stored in those root systems. If we think about a plant, if we take a grass plant and it's growing up and the animal comes by and nips that off, that solar panel has just been cut off. The plant has to pull reserves from the roots in order to grow a new solar panel. And then once that's reestablished, then it can grow and it can harvest energy or create energy, harvest energy, put it into the roots for use later on. If that plant is continually grazed, eventually it's killed off because it's like starving to death, right? And that's something that Gary mentioned. Even though these thistles and goldenrod have not been killed off right now, the fact that the leaves have been stripped from the stems means that the solar panel is no longer working. And so it will change that plant's ability next spring to regrow. It will inhibit that growth a little bit. Will it kill it outright? Probably not, because we're going to put up a back fence and we want to have goldenrod and some thistle. We want diversity, right? Diversity is the goal here, because the greater the diversity in our societies, the greater the diversity in our ecological settings, the greater the buffering against periods of stress, right? One of the things that actually Dr. Fred Provenza from Utah State University, he's an animal behaviorist, but he's also, they've been trying to answer this question. He and many of his graduate students have been trying to answer the question, why would sheep or cattle or goats, why would these different types of livestock go after spiny plants or plants that have a large number of what we would consider noxious or toxic compounds? And the answer typically comes back that when you do an assay on Canada thistle, it's incredibly high in micronutrients that the animals need. It's incredibly high in protein and pretty high in energy. In other words, it's good food. And again, in that ecological model of diversity creating buffering, the more selection our animals, our livestock have, or even our wild animals, the more selection that they have to consume, the more that they can counteract some of the toxic compounds. So there's a plant, a grass called Kentucky 31 fescue. All right, it's a tall fescue variety. There's an endemic, an endophyte, a fungus that lives in a symbiosis inside that plant that produces a number of alkaloid compounds that are really tough for animals to deal with. They're ergotamines. They work. There's a fungus called ergot, right? I don't know if you've ever heard of Saint, is it not St. Elmo's fire, Saint Midas's dance, right? Fidus's dance. Okay. So what it does is the compound is a vasoconstrictor. It causes the capillaries in your extremities or in the extremities of the animal to close down. Well, in a hot environment, particularly, that inhibits the animal's ability to shed heat. Or in a cold environment, if those compounds are at work inside the animal, it inhibits the animal's ability to keep its feet and its extremities warm. So some interesting work has been done out at Utah State looking at why grazing animals will prefer to go after certain plants and then will eat this Kentucky 31 fescue at no harm. Turns out that plants like hairy vetch, trefoil, oak leaves, plants that are very high in compressed tannins, they take these compounds in through these plants, which are also high in protein and high in other compounds that they want. The compressed tannins neutralize the ergotamines in the tall fescue. So it's a win-win. Not only do they neutralize those ergotamines, when they neutralize them, one of the byproducts is bypass protein that the animal can use. So not only are they neutralizing the compressed tannins, which are kind of make their stomachs upset, and the ergotamines, which inhibit blood flow in the animal, they get this beneficial bypass protein. I'm sorry if the chemistry and so on is getting kind of elevated. My point is, the greater the diversity, the better the system works, right? And so that's what we've got. Why do animals eat these spiny thistles or the leaves from the goldenrod? Or we've got some barberry up here, which has spines on the stems, but also a number of compounds in the leaves that we would think are not so great. It's all about diversity. They can eat this, and the animals, just in the same way that we get some biofeedback, right? If we sit down to a very high protein meal, what do we start craving? After a short period of time, we don't want any more steak or any more tuna or any more egg, right? We want starches, sugars especially, right? We want dessert. That's why, believe it or not, that's why we finish meals typically with sugary or sweet or starchy desserts. It's a biofeedback thing, and it's become cultural, but biologically that's what's going on. We're fairly finite in our thinking, we humans. I think most creatures are, but we're fairly finite, even though we think we're pretty clever. In our search to identify and break things down, in our reductionist thinking, we want to know the specifics of why this plant does this thing or this animal does that thing, and how can we make our dairy cows or our sheep or our beef cattle grow to the maximum. Well, it's all about protein and energy. Well, it's not just about protein and energy. It's about some of these other micronutrients that we need or that our animals need. It's about the way in which our animals are interacting with their environment and the way that we interact with them, whether it's in eating them or harvesting their wool by shearing it and spinning it, that we can't look at things from such a reductionist standpoint for too much longer. We need to know specifics, but then we need to zoom out and take a look, a holistic look, that 30,000 foot view. What does this landscape look like from 30,000 feet? And then, just like Gary did, what does it look like down here? Here's some fertilizer. What does it look like when we pull these plants back and we look at the soil surface, is there evidence of earthworm activity? You know, there will be if that layer of insulation, that layer of grass that has been laid down by not the grazing impact, but the hoof action of those animals. When that lays down, now we've got that layer of insulation. It's not just an insulation from the sun and temperature, both hot and cold extremes, but it's a layer of insulation against rain. The leading cause of soil compaction is not animal impact. It's raindrops. When we have a massive rainstorm, those drops come down and they will impact every single square inch. But if there's a layer of foliage, the energy is dissipated at the impact point and it's a shock absorber. And then the water filters across the surface of the soil and is able to soak in. Gravity works. It still works today. And this slope, if the vegetation wasn't here, there would be tremendous rill erosion, right? And we'd have some real problems. This slope would end up at the bottom in a very short order.